Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this first panel discussion as part of the Xtrax and Stockton International Riverside Festival 2021 Outdoor Art Showcase. My name is Hannah Hartley, and I'm a project manager at Xtrax based in Manchester, UK. I'm a white woman in my 30s. I have mid-length brown hair, and today I'm wearing black dungarees over a grey stripy top. I use the pronouns she, her. Before introducing our chair for today's discussion, I just wanted to run through a few practicalities. We have over 150 delegates registered on Swapcard from 19 countries, and it's great to see so many of you watching right now. Please feel free to use the chat space in the live discussion box, which you can find on the right hand of your screen, to say hello, who you are from, and where you're from. If you would like to ask our speakers any questions, please also post these in the live discussion box under questions, and we will share as many as we have time for in the Q&A part of this session. For access purposes, all sessions today will be live captioned in English and BSL interpreted. This session is also being recorded and will be available to watch again in the Swapcard platform until Friday, 6th of August. Once the event has closed, the recording will remain available on the Xtrax YouTube channel. Feel free to comment, post and tweet about this event using the hashtags SIRF 2021 and make sure to follow Xtrax and SIRF on social media. Okay, so without further ado, I'm incredibly pleased to invite on screen our chair for this session, Feimatta Conteh, Environmental Sustainability Manager for Manchester International Festival. Welcome, Feimatta, and I'll now hand over to you to introduce our speakers and kickstart the session.
Hello, thank you so much, Hannah, for that introduction. So yes, as Hannah said, I'm Feimatta Conteh, the Environmental Sustainability Manager of Manchester International Festival. I'm a light-skinned brown woman in my early 40s with short curly hair and brown eyes, and I smile a lot. Today I'm wearing a grey top and 2 necklaces with black and white beads on. I'm delighted to be part of the discussion today and to be chairing it, because the topic of sustainable touring and who pays for it is something that I've been tasked with looking into for the Manchester International Festival. So I'll invite our speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll open up into the topic. So Ruben, if you'd like to turn your camera on, introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Thank you. I'm Ruben Kench. I am the Director for Environment, Culture, Events and Leisure at Stockton Council. I'm a thin, fair-skinned male in his 50s, grey hair, and today I'm wearing a blue shirt, which I think strikes the right balance between formal and informal.
And back to me, because I can work my mute button really well. And I'd like to invite Marcus now to introduce themselves. Marcus, you need to unmute. So you've been taking tips from me. I'm afraid, Marcus, you're still muted, but we can see you.
Okay.
Fantastic. Well done.
Now? Okay. After 1.5 years, I should have learned this. Sorry. Yeah. My name is Marcus. I'm from Munich in Germany. I'm a white man in my mid-50s. I have dark hair. I wear glasses and have a black shirt. Yes, like I said, I'm from Munich. I'm an expert in sustainability and culture. I have my own agency. And before I started my own agency, I was working as a promoter for an international festival in Munich. It's called the Tollwood Festival. And should I start my presentation now? So?
Not yet. We just have to introduce the other speakers, and then,
okay,
and then we'll
fine.
get to you, Marcus.
Yeah,
but wonderful. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
And representing Metatheater, we have P. Burton Morgan. So P, if you'd like to turn your camera on and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi, I'm P. Burton Morgan, Artistic Director of Metatheater. I'm a white person in their 30s with a shaved head, brown eyes and a grey strappy top.
And P, you'll be joined later, won't you, both,
Oh, yeah.
by Will?
By my co-artistic director, Will. Shall I let him describe himself when
when he arrives, but just so people know you'll be there. So that's our wonderful panel. And one of the things that I was really excited about this panel is I think across the range and breadth of their experience, I think we've got some really interesting things that we can discuss and share and learn. And one of the things that I was really excited about for this panel, just in the title, it's Sustainable Touring, Who Pays for It? So for me, this is about moving beyond sort of, you know, the sort of concepts and the ideals and the principles of things. So actually thinking about the practicalities of, like, when we're doing international touring, who is responsible for different elements of it? How do we bring it all together? What models can we be exploring? And how can we actually make those differences rather than just talking about them? And as I said, I'm the environmental and sustainability manager of the Manchester International Festival. And that's a real focus of, like, international working is in our name, and it's what we do. But obviously we're living in an age of climate crisis, and we're also coming through a global pandemic. So what does it mean to do international work with those two big big things in the world? So as I said, I'm really interested to hear from our speakers and have a discussion afterwards. So I think if we're all right to do it now, we can pass on to our first speaker, who's going to be Ruben Kench, the head of culture, leisure, events and environment from Stockton. And Ruben, I'm very sad that the Stockton International Riverside Festival isn't happening these couple of days, but considering what the weather is like in Manchester at the moment, where we've got torrential thunderstorms, I wonder if maybe, you know, if it was happening, the weather might have done for it. So I'll hand over to you, Ruben, now, if you'd like to share your presentation.
Thank you. I can say at the moment we've been spared the thunderstorms, and we've got some relatively bright weather here on the streets of Stockton. But as well as welcoming everyone to this SIRF connected event, I did want to apologise to those of you who had hoped to be on the streets of Stockton enjoying real, live, outdoor art, the physical, visceral, immersive and communal experience that we've craved throughout the pandemic. Our decision to cancel the festival was driven by both the local rates of COVID infection and also by concerns about the resilience of our plans and the availability of so many critical support providers, technicians, paramedics, traffic management personnel, media, communications, and so on. The experience has been a reminder of how complex the web of enablers and suppliers is, and that, I think, is relevant to the discussion about sustainability. I'm not going to use slides, but I do want to reflect on three questions. What is sustainability? Who pays for the extra cost of more sustainable practices? Can we get more value out of the unavoidable carbon costs? So the headline for the session is to explore sustainable touring, but what do we mean by sustainable? Well, if it weren't for the pandemic, we would have been at ARC for this session, sitting in a vibrant social and creative space, a venue that plays a crucial role in the local community and an equally important role in a non-geographically defined artistic community. 20 years ago, when I came to work at Stockton Council, my first task was to try to resurrect ARC from insolvent liquidation. It was locked, empty and dark. Sitting then with accountants and facility management specialists, we concluded that the best way to reduce the overheads of the business, to minimize its losses and make it sustainable within the identified subsidy was for it to remain closed. We wouldn't derive any value from it, but it would be sustainable. When we talk about environmental sustainability, the best way to minimize our contribution to climate change and the species loss is to consume nothing or to produce no waste, or better still, to be dead, to be in our own insolvent liquidation, perhaps. There are certainly those who will argue that the best thing for the future of the planet would be the extinction of humans, and it may come to that. It sounds a bit gloomy, but where are we right now? Well, if genuine sustainability were our goal, we shouldn't develop skills and shows that make people want to travel halfway around the world to see them or have us travel to them. We shouldn't devise products or experiences to merely entertain. There may be an offset benefit from making work that highlights the climate change issue and encourages people to think about their own contribution. But of course, we wouldn't want to consign all our artistic practice to that didactic or proselytizing mission. So we're going to talk about being more sustainable, a bit less damaging. And we need to see that see our impact in context of our impact in the rest of our lives and weigh it against what we believe the mitigating benefits are. To do that, we'd need to know something about how damaging the things are that we want to do in relative terms to enable us to make the biggest difference for the least loss of utility. Now, I'm not a scientist, and there are fellow panel members who undoubtedly know more about this than I do. But it seems reasonable to fall in within the prevailing wisdom of a carbon footprint as a shorthand for sustainability, including a carbon equivalent calculation of the other greenhouse gases, often expressed in the term CO2e. Of course, the measure CO2e doesn't really address habitat loss and biodiversity, except indirectly, but it's a good proxy for wider sustainability. My contention is that if we want to develop more sustainable production and distribution models and then calculate the cost so that we can explore who's going to pay the higher financial price to enable a lower planetary price, we'd need to understand the carbon footprint of our sector in detail. We need to understand it in a finer grained way than we currently do. Assessing the impact of our work in all its parts helps us move beyond the simplistic, helps us see the hidden costs as well as the obvious ones, and that'll be important if we try and sell those costs to others. Digital seems preferable to carrying heavy stuff across the continent, but Zoom calls and cloud storage are underpinned by acres of servers built from rare compounds sprawling across the desert in places like California and requiring constant cooling. Choosing not to take the internal flight and driving instead feels like a green decision, but the increasingly popular and grotesquely oversized electric SUV can have a higher CO2 footprint than the same seat on EasyJet. So we've got to understand it and get beneath the surface and try not to be demoralized by what we find. We have to determine which negative impacts are avoidable and then try to work out who pays the price for the unavoidable, other than the planet. So on the question of who pays, it's simple, the buyer. As with any commodity, for its production to be sustainable, in the conventional monetary sense, requires the purchaser to pay the whole price, plus a bit. But just as with other commodities, if one vendor seeks to recoup the full cost while others are ignoring or avoiding incurring some of the costs, they won't survive. If we, as a sector, start to build in greater costs for increased reuse and recycling, greater fees for slower travel by people, longer delays for slower transport of kit, and so on, we need to ensure we've established either a commitment to full cost inclusion in all or most suppliers, or an understanding of the extra planetary value that justifies the extra financial cost to our purchasers, or an approach to commissioning or purchasing that enables the full cost version to be viable and hampers the sellers or ignoring the planetary cost. In effect, a cartel. Keeping with the language of market forces, we do need to work on supply side mechanisms and standards, but we also need to think about the demand side. What can the purchasers do to shift the basics of what is deemed affordable? On behalf of Stockton Council and the Stockton International Riverside Festival, I can commit to paying more for a more sustainable product. We'd like to be part of any collaboration that seeks to commission and present work more sustainably. I'd like SIRF to be part of that demand side shift, requiring and specifying a reduced carbon footprint. But I'd need to be able to demonstrate the value of that to the politicians and the public whose money I'm spending. I'd need the sector to know where the CO2e impacts are, and if possible, to be able to estimate the carbon saving to balance the extra cost within the budget. So what about the question of getting more value? In the UK, many of us will be familiar with the phrase reduce, reuse, recycle. It's a powerful reminder that the most important thing is to avoid unnecessary consumption in the first place, then see how much of the stuff can be used more than once, and then recycle the raw materials of anything that has come to the end of its life. Can we be guided by that principle? In street arts, we've often sought to present shows that are exclusive. At SIRF, we love to host a UK premiere. We don't want a show that's on a few weeks later 100 miles away. But since 80% of our audiences are local, is that logical? Distance is a significant factor in the carbon footprint calculation. Should we be collaborating as regions more often, seeking to get bigger return for the carbon of moving something across the world? Can we reuse more shows? Every show is different every time it's shown. An audience is different, the space is different, the cultural context, and as already mentioned today, the weather is different. Can we increase the extent to which the show responds to the site, getting more value out of the embedded carbon every time we do so? Gone are the days when everyone had to live within the circus train, effectively spending their lives on tour. If the reuse model resulted in residencies rather than tours, prolonged stays in countries or continents rather than a week with a flight in and a flight out at either end, would that be realistic for the artists and the producers? But this illustration brings us full circle, because to know whether it is best to transport the families and lives of performers for slow and uninterrupted tours around a region than it was to fly the minimum number of people in for the shortest period of time and make as much of the non-human parts as possible locally, would require us to understand exactly where our hidden CO2 equivalent was. And that's our first step. I look forward to that challenge. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Ruben. I think that was a really brilliant presentation, really great set of questions and ways that you're thinking about them. I like that idea of the circus train and being on tour forever. And actually that brings in one of the things about sustainability, is environmental sustainability, but also the sustainability of the workforce and people who are involved in making shows. I'm not going to waffle on too much in between the speakers, but just to remind people that if you have questions or comments or things, then to be posting them in Swapcard, and then when we get to the discussion after we've heard from all of our speakers, we can bring some of those into the discussion, and I can be your mouthpiece for those, as well as sharing some of my own thoughts and questions as well. So Marcus, if you're ready now with your presentation, I'd love to invite you to share your screen and just turn your video on, turn your microphone on. You can do that, and then share your screen with your presentation, because I understand you have some slides for us.
Of course. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. As long as I'm not the only not native speaker, I feel much more comfortable to have a presentation. So I prepared a little bit. So let me share the screen. Just a second. Okay, can you see it? Hopefully, yeah. So welcome Sustainable Touring, who pays for it? Yeah, I just want to introduce myself very short. I had, like I said before, many years of experience in leading positions in theaters in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And my last main role was I was the director of the theater program at the Tollwood Festival in Munich. So the beginning of this year, I founded the agency Whirlpool for artist management and consulting for theaters, also on the topic of sustainability. Actually, I'm very busy with the innovation program of the Federal Ministry of Economics in planning and reopening of the theaters in Germany after Corona. So to the topic of Corona, I will come back later. So my work for sustainability, I was working for Tollwood several times in other symposia and panels about green culture in the last years. I'm a member of the working group in Montreal at the Climate and Circus working group. I gave seminars on green events and several locations.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Marcus.
Yeah.
I was just chatting with our technical team, and unfortunately your presentation isn't showing. I just wanted to check whether it was showing on somebody's screen. Okay. So I wonder if you could just try sharing your screen again, and then I can confirm, because I should be able to see it through my screen. I'm ever so sorry about that interruption.
Of course. Just a second. So sharing.
Yes, perfect. It's there now. I'm reading German, which I haven't done since I was in school, but I really appreciate doing that.
Yeah, but now I've lost the presentation.
Oh no!
No. I will find it just a second.
We'll talk amongst ourselves. But yes, I'm always in awe when I'm at events and things, and I hear people kind of saying, oh, English isn't my language or whatever. It's like, your English is so much better than any of my German ever would be. So
you're so polite.
Humbled. But I'm so humbled that people are doing it. So yes, if we have a reset now, rewind, and
okay, can you see it?
Up now. Yes. So if you just press to present, which is the little button down on the bottom bar, or I don't know how you call it in German.
It's here from the beginning.
Von beginnen.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay,
thank you ever so much.
Okay, I will run through again. Yeah. So, yeah, and so you don't need the presentation to see what I've done. I said already. You can see me in pictures. It's not very important. I will jump to the last slide. I gave several seminars on green events in the last month and years. So. My main work for the sustainability was when I was working for the Tollwood Festival, which is one of the oldest festival who tries to combine sustainability, engagement, and culture. Based in Munich, it's twice a year, and I have some facts about the Tollwood and the environment. You can read it. We asked for we took a lot of care about climate protection with green energy. The festival is climate neutral. We compensate CO2 if it's necessary. And we were very proud that 75% of the visitors come environmental friendly, so by public transport or bicycles. We offer green catering since 2003. We offer completely biological food, which is a big step in being sustainable. We have I think, quite good waste concepts. We offer stalls with food stalls and stalls for handcraft, where we ask the traders to offer fair trade things. And we did several things outside of the festival campaign. Bio für Kinder, it's called Biological for Children. And yeah, so we tried to save 850 tons of CO2 per year. So the festival is twice a year, in summer and winter. Happens around 4 weeks. 4 weeks in summer, 4 weeks in winter. So then we developed a lot, and also we learned a lot, learning by doing. Like Ruben said, I think the concentration in sustainability here is now we have the concentration on the topic of climate change. Everybody knows sustainability is much more. And yeah, concerning the current situation in comparison to Corona, we asked the Germans last year, what did we learn from the current situation? And when you can see, I try to translate it, that the environmental protection and climate action is highly relevant for the Germans, and I guess for the people in the UK too, despite coronavirus. So 65% think the environmental protection is important, and 62% think that the corona pandemic is important. So we are actually in this situation where we can see, it's more important than the actual corona pandemic. But the question of today around is who pays for it? And I think when I tried to prepare everything, it was a little bit a provocative question, because I think everyone has to pay the contribution, and we should want to pay for it. The sponsors and the subsidy providers will pay because they will demand it from us, from the artists organizer. The German Federal Council Foundation and the Goethe Institute will introduce sustainability as a binding criterion for funding, and therefore also have to accept that this will also mean higher funding amount. The artists and the companies have to be aware that higher travel expenses and production costs have to be calculated. And last but not least, the audience has to be aware that they have to pay fair, and fair means higher prices for fair productions. So I try to be a little bit more concrete. So concrete implementations for your venue, for your event, for you as a company. I have some examples. Yeah. So in the terms of mobility, I think everybody knows this. Yeah. Plane versus trains, make it more attractive. Yeah. Everybody, a lot of people know the example from the Helsingborg Symphony Orchestra. They decided to invite only conductors who come by train. They don't accept conductors coming by plane, and maybe you know Helsingborg is not really in the center of Europe. It's quite difficult to arrive to travel to Helsingborg. Yeah, the audience mobility is also very important. Public transport tickets. So you can have a lot of ideas, and it's mean. What does it mean? You can ask. No, you don't have to ask. You have to convince your audience in a festival to go the way together with you and what you offer. And we have now Rock Festival, for example, who offer extra benefits for the audience, such as pre-admission to the concerts, so that they can reserve the best seats first. We have, for example, we had a free bike check while the people are on the festival ground. Yeah, we all have bikes where the brakes drag or the chains needs oiling. So this can be done conveniently and easily while parking the bike on the festival ground. So when I'm advising theaters and festivals on sustainability in the last time, yeah, we realize that they're often the simple ideas who have the huge impact on audience behavior and allow the audience to share and approve the ideas and creativity. The audience realizes, and that's the most important thing, that you are serious and not just making everything more expensive, but often the small ideas can carry the big ideas. So these are the small ideas. Yeah. Do everyone need to have really high color program booklets? Yeah. Have you ever thought about your giveaway about disposable items? Yeah. And I think that's it. So actually, that's my short introduction. I hope you understood everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Marcus. Not only did we understand everything, but I think there were some really brilliant ideas discussed in that. If you could just stop sharing your screen now, if you find that button for it.
Yeah. So,
it comes through, doesn't it? It's always that way. It's almost like when...
Stop and now. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So thank you ever so much for that, Marcus. And actually, I think what you were saying there about some of the small things having a big impact and such, like we've just delivered the Manchester International Festival, so it was from the 1st to the 18th of July this year, and something that somebody in our team managed to find was compostable face masks, because we were delivering it as though we're still in phase 3, and it's just a small thing, and it's going to still, it is going to go into compost. But the number of people who were so excited about what that symbolized and what that meant, so you kind of think actually environmental impact not that big, but visible impact. So yes, we'll get into the discussion, because I do talk too much in this way. So we've got our final set of speakers for this discussion. We have Burton Morgan and Will Reynolds from Metatheater, and as Will wasn't with us at the beginning of the discussion, I'd just like to invite them to give a little visual description, and then between the two screens, I'm sure you'll work out how to do your presentation. So, Will, if you'd just like to introduce yourself to everybody, that'd be great.
Hi everyone. I'm Will. I'm half of Metatheater with P. I am a quick visual description. I'm a white, I'm in my late 30s. I have a big beard that I like to think is much less messy than it really is. And I'm because I wasn't here at the beginning, I'm joining from a lighting hire company. So I'm surrounded by photos on the wall of all of the big stadium events, which is very sort of fitting, thinking about the sustainability of some of them.
Shall I jump in, Will? Because you missed the first. Just because a lot of what we're going to say, I think I'm just editing to sort of speak directly to what's been said before. So we run a mid-scale touring theatre company, predominantly touring indoors to venues, although we have toured outdoors as well. So a lot of the lessons I think that we can share we'll try and make them be kind of relevant. I want to dive. I'm aware that with these things, the talking bit always takes too long and there's no space for questions. I need to go slow, but I want to keep ours as concise as possible and just sort of throw out some provocations to the group, really, some of which speak to what we've heard before. Who pays for it? I think, of course, it should be everyone, but I think we have to realize that for those of us who are engaged and really care, we have to make those. We have to work as hard as possible to make that palatable, both to funders, to audiences, to any of those people. I mean, certainly within venues, they're massively time poor and they're resource poor. So where we have toured with a green rider or tried to engage a venue in some of those more sustainable practices, and even more so now, they are really kind of struggling capacity wise. So where we have had more success is internally. So who should pay for it? It will always be the people who are emotionally invested. So we are a net zero touring company, and we achieve that essentially by paying for offsetting. It's as simple as that. Our carbon footprint isn't huge because we don't tour, but the majority of the carbon footprint from our work is touring the set and the lighting in trucks. Like, that's where the big carbon comes from. So my other kind of provocation is I love the idea of the small ideas can carry the big ideas, but also let's not beat ourselves up about the small areas where our sector and where touring is unsustainable, because actually it's the big things like transport of stuff that are making the big difference. And the other thing, speaking to what's been said before, the theatre as a or performing arts as a form, in terms of greening the economy, performing arts is people rich, and we want to be moving into people rich industries. So although we can go, oh dear, the carbon footprint of this and that, like, bigger picture, our industry is not it's not at all one of the worst, which is not to say we shouldn't do our bit, but I think it's worth remembering that sectors where there's a lot of investment into people are really good from a kind of bigger picture green economy. Other things that we have tried to encourage venues to engage with, which has already been touched on, but if it's a ticketed event, doing like a Green Wednesday where people can get a cheaper ticket if they prove that they've come by public transport. But again, there is a cost to that, and it's a conversation with the venue about who absorbs that cost. We are predominantly, we work under a subsidised model with Arts Council funding, and so quite often we will build those things into the budget, but that's a choice as artists, because essentially we're going, these costs, it costs more. It costs more time and resource to be more environmentally sustainable. So that's a choice to go, that part of that budget is going there, rather than in, say, big flashy set and costume. And let's put more resource into the time it takes to source materials, costumes, set, secondhand, than, you know, the fireworks and the bells and whistles and the unsustainable glitter that you might buy new. That's enough from me. Will, brief.
I guess I'll talk a little bit about our sort of journey into sustainability as a sort of our working through, looking into our sustainability, and as Poppy sort of already touched on. So we are a touring company, and we started sort of looking at what emissions sort of we own, which I think is quite relevant to the idea of who pays for what in reductions. So again, as Poppy said, we tour a lot into venues, but I think the same would apply equally to outdoor work as well, that we don't particularly look at emissions that we don't own, and quite a lot of that means that some things sort of, in the way we look at them, fall onto the venues. For example, audience travel, which definitely has already been talked about now, as quite a big part of it. The other parts of our emissions that we definitely do own ourselves, and we sort of, the way we look at who pays for them, as Poppy again has already said, we sort of take the idea that things that we own, we pay for. We're working under a subsidized model, so actually we don't pay, like, it's paid for by either changing the way we budget for things or having to fundraise more. I think the idea that venues or promoters are going to pay for this stuff, until they can start putting ticket prices up for that, they're not going to be able to pay anymore. I think it's fairly well recognised that actually there's not enough money going around in the arts as it is, and in the touring world as it is, and so for us to sort of turn to a venue or a promoter and say, you want our show? Well, we've just doubled the price because we're going to be more sustainable. They're going to say, we only ever pay the maximum that we can, and so they're not able to do that, and so sort of the onus becomes on us. Equally, I think that the onus doesn't have to be on increasing the total cost of a project. It doesn't have to be putting the total budget up. It's about reassigning where your priorities are. You could look at, we have to have a really flashy bit of lighting or some really clever bit of set in this, and therefore we have to spend less on something else. Or you could say, we have to travel more sustainably, therefore we have to spend less on something else. So it's not about putting the total cost, necessarily about putting the total costs up. I think that on top of actual financial cost, it's also really, really important to think about time cost, resource cost, as Poppy again has touched on already. A lot of things don't cost any more financially if you can find a way to spend a bit more time thinking about them and working them out. We're sort of taking the rather broad approach of trying to shift, again, as Poppy was touching on earlier, from spending money on things and materials into spending money on people, which, for example, means that we can spend more time sourcing secondhand props or costume or items, or we can spend longer figuring out the best way to do the travel rather than, spending more on the easier to book option kind of thing. Doesn't apply to everything. Traveling by train across Europe takes several days, flying takes several hours. It doesn't, and often the train costs a lot more. So it doesn't necessarily apply to everything, but I think the other thing that I wanted to touch on briefly, I'm conscious of time here, was that the idea of small things making a difference and not sort of discounting that and recognizing that and the value of that. And I think that Feimatta, your example of the compostable face masks was a brilliant one, not because, as you said, they're still going to be disposed of, they're still going to be composted, they were still produced, there is still an impact in those things. The benefit isn't in the thing itself necessarily. I imagine that made a very small difference to your footprint as a festival in Manchester. But what it does do, and a face mask is so brilliant for this, is everybody sees it. And so you put that idea that you're taking this stuff seriously and you're trying to make a change out to thousands of people instantly. And I think that that's where those small things make a really big difference. There's a big debate about, or a lot of sort of controversy about the ideas of plastic straws and all of those sorts of things and all those bans that are, in environmental terms, essentially pointless, because plastic straws are not the problem with plastic in the oceans. Fishing nets are the problem with plastic in the oceans, or plastic carrier bags. But if you do something that's very, very visible, then a lot of people start thinking about it. And hopefully that's a way for them to start moving into the next step and you to be able to do the next step as well. So I think that's where those small things really take into their own. And I guess I would say, absolutely, those small things are brilliant. Absolutely do them, but make sure that you talk about doing them. I think that's the key to all of that.
Just two concrete examples that we do. I think Marcus mentioned programs. So we don't have programs anymore. We don't even have free sheets. We just put a QR code up in where we tour to, and people can access that information that way. And on that QR code, we explain why we don't do programs for environmental reasons. And this was touched on in the opening speech in terms of content. So some of our work, we're touring an eco rock musical next year, which the environmental sustainability, climate crisis nuance is in every aspect of that, both content and how we tour it. But actually every single show we have in the future has, even in small thematic ways, the way the characters talk about the climate and ecological crisis as a given. I mean, it's not a happy thing, but as a given, as artists, we're creating a universe, and that universe can acknowledge and engage with the climate crisis, even if that's not the subject matter of the piece. But again, it's the visibility of those things. So that's part, it just adds to a general conversation in the world. Shall we conclude there? Well, you've got one closing remark.
There's a really brilliant initiative by Albert. I don't know if anybody's come across Albert, the film and TV industry. It's part of BAFTA sustainability group and support group. They have a scheme called Planet Placement, which is sort of play on product placement, but trying to persuade people to write issues of either the climate crisis itself or solutions and ways that our lives will change in the future for the better, hopefully, sort of into their programming. And I guess, I mean, that's exactly what Poppy was just saying, that's something that we've sort of really taken to heart in our work, and I think is a rather brilliant approach.
Brilliant. That's great. Thanks so much, P and Will, for that great discussion. There's lots of thoughts buzzing around my head, and sometimes I can kind of struggle to be like, okay, put the things out there. But yes, Albert and that planet placement is marvelous, because I remember when Albert was starting up, and actually one of my contacts in Manchester worked for a long time on Coronation Street, which is a very regular British soap opera. I think it's the longest running soap opera. It's been going about 60 or 70 years, and they've been doing planet placement in Coronation Street. So in terms of environmental messaging, it's a lot about kind of who is conveying those messages to people, and who are the messengers that people kind of pay attention with. And I know this conversation is about who pays for sustainable touring, but it's very interesting thinking back to something that Ruben mentioned right at the beginning about art not being didactic, and I can't say the word, but that thing where you're telling other people a message, and so not instrumentalizing our art. So in the absence of a live audience, I'd just like to give a big round of applause for all of our speakers for the brilliant topics that you've raised and the way you've presented them and brought them to us. And if I could just invite you all to turn your cameras on now and unmute yourself so that we can actually get into the conversation. P, you made this point before that there's often lots of time for the presentations, but not so much for the conversations. So thank you all so much for that. We do have some questions coming in from the audience, but also what I just wanted to do is we're kind of coming into this discussion, and I appreciate it's always strange having a discussion with little squares on a screen rather than sitting around a table, as it were. I just wondered if any of the four of you had any thoughts that had occurred to you maybe while you were listening to each other's presentations or something. Ruben, thank you so much. So yeah, if you just raise your hands and I can call on you. So Ruben, if you'd like to speak.
I guess I wanted to ask, I mean, it might be a question for Will or P, but that idea that, for example, the face mask is a good symbol of us needing to take account of costs. Why can't we apply that same principle to the price of the work? Because, Will, you said, you know, we shouldn't be paying more for it. Well, surely we've got to understand that it costs more, but that at the moment the planet's paying part of the price. So why isn't paying more the equivalent?
I'm also just going to add in a thing to that, Will, before you respond, because I remember when Ruben, you were talking about that, and this is moving out of the sphere of the arts sector and stuff. I sometimes wonder, like, when we go to supermarkets and we buy food that's that cheap, I know food isn't that cheap to produce, so where is the cost being paid? And Ruben, you've got it exactly right. The planet's paying for it, and so it's that idea of these hidden costs that we're not willing to accept in the model of the world we're in. Anyway, sorry, Will, the question was to you.
Will, unless you want to answer, only because I was here for Ruben's initial speech, I might just speak to that, because I was really struck by those talking about market forces. But of course, our sector isn't viable by market forces. It lives within subsidy, and there's always a far greater supply of art than there is a demand for art, both from audiences and from venues. So I think that I would love venues and touring partners to absolutely accept that this thing is going to cost more, but you are very unusual in recognizing the price the planet's paying. Well, that's a tongue twister, the price the planet is paying. So I think that it's a very, you would very easily, as the artistic company, price yourself out of the market, because they would just go, we'll take this other show that is cheaper.
I think just to add to that, the way, sorry, Ruben, very briefly, the way that we approach pricing our shows for venues is not quite as simple as these are the costs for this. Because of that subsidy, it skews the way everything goes. So we're not saying when we approach a venue, there's a very complicated sort of mental calculation going on, essentially, of what individual venues can afford within a tour, what different, what's important sort of to us socially in different areas that we go to, reaching different audiences within that. And so we're never, ever, I don't think, literally charging a venue exactly what that one performance cost, because we're also then not factoring in, you know, the subsidy that went into the creating it, or the fact that actually we made it last year and we've sort of kept it, and we've, you know, all of those different things. So I think that's what all I meant by we can't expect to simply just rock up to the venue and say, well, you know, it's going to be £5,000 extra, please, because that calculation isn't that simple in the first place, and they know it's not that simple in the first place. Absolutely, we all have to start accepting that we have to spend more on some things.
Yeah.
And I fundamentally agree with that, and I find myself banging my head against the wall so often with people who don't recognize that things have to change and that we have to make compromises in somewhere in order to make those changes, whether that compromise is in saving a bit of money on something else, whether it's finding a bit of money from somewhere else, whether it's doing something differently.
I was keen, sorry, Chair, but I was really keen to shift the burden from the company defining that cost and trying to ensure that that cost is met by swallowing it and transferring resources from other things. I'm trying to shift the burden from the company to the purchaser. And I know that it was simplistic, you know, it is a, you know, provocation, but it really is about agreeing some of those standards in procurement or you know, specifications that would enable your shows to be viable, even with that cost properly represented. And
that's a brilliant attitude. As Poppy said, unfortunately, there are not very many. Very, very quickly, before I know you want to move on. That idea that we have of sort of looking at who owns the emissions might help in that, because certainly when you're dealing with international touring or those sorts of options, often it's not the company doing the booking of some of that. So, you know, if you're talking about international travel and it's the promoter is organising that travel, then naturally traveling in a more sustainable way, the cost would then automatically by default fall on the promoter. So I think there are ways that it can.
I wondered actually, Marcus, as an agency, as somebody, I think you've been involved in international touring and booking, if you had any thoughts on that. I think what we're getting to here is kind of an understanding of the financial models that sit behind touring, and then therefore how we can put that. I'm sorry to kind of put you on the spot, Marcus, but I wondered if you had something to add to that.
Yeah. So I first want to add another idea. It's mean we all have to think, why are we get subsidies? Why are we founded? It's mean I think art and culture plays a social role model. And this we don't have to forget. It's clear that it's a task of the culture to name social problems, and this. It's not a social problem. It's a problem for all of us. So why we are doing this, and we have to make suggestions for improvement. That's our idea, and I think we don't have to ask the festival or the audience. I think we have to ask the people who will fund us, who will give subsidy to us, and say, okay, now. We are living in a dramatic area where the world is changing and where the environmental is changing, and we are one of the part of the persons here who can change, or who can present ideas and who give suggestions to the small steps we was talking before, and to change the things, and I think I was thinking a lot, and I was asked very often, okay, what can you change in international touring? And it's also it's a very simple question and a very complicated answer, because of course we know the environmental friendliest festival is the first festival who will never happen. That's the most and of course it's when you're asking the brass band coming from the neighborhood, coming by bike, and we all drink apple juice from the trees falling in our neighborhoods, but you know, we are all living in a globalized world. It's it's a function of the art and the culture to bring other cultures, to bring the ideas from Africa, from Asia, also from other European countries, to realize how the people are thinking, and that's the most important things. Of course, we can work on the small things, and think about environmental friendly touring, just going from one week to the other, not more than 100 kilometers or 100 miles, and all the ideas. You all know this, in practice, for the practice, it's always very difficult. But we have to think that we are part of presenting the world, and it's much cheaper to invite a company from Asia to present Asian culture in Europe than everybody from the audience is traveling to Asia. Yeah, that's one of the things too. Yeah, and we also go eating in the Asian restaurants. We go eat in the Chinese restaurants, in the Indian restaurants, wherever. Yeah, nobody asks, okay, have you ever thought about the curry? Yeah, about the coconut milk and all the things who are carried. Yeah, it's normal for us. Yeah.
Yeah, we live in a globalized world with incredibly complex supply chains and things. It just makes me remember one of the first things that Ruben was talking about in terms of like the complex supply chains and enablers that go into creating an artwork. And then if you're thinking about kind of who's responsible for which, all the pieces of carbon, and Will and P, I really admire the fact that we will look at the carbon footprint we're responsible for, and then maybe talk and advise with people who are outside of that. And then also that idea, Marcus, of and P, you mentioned this as well. Globally, the carbon footprint from the arts, I mean, I don't know, but it's small. Isn't there the thing that like 70% of carbon emissions in the world are the responsibility of 10 companies or something like that? But that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying to do what we can under the areas that we control. I've got a question that's come through from the audience. It's big, so we're going to get into it, and maybe we can start with Metatheater, and then we'll bring in Marcus and Ruben around. So the question is, how do you offset? So we'll get into it, but just before you answer, I'd just like to say that Julie's Bicycle, an organisation that people might be aware of that are UK based but also work internationally, have a really good webinar about carbon offsetting and carbon accounting. So if people want to check that out, I really recommend it. But yes, how do you offset? And then the other part of it is there seems to be lots of controversy around it. So greenwashing, and then you can think about where carbon offsetting projects are taking place. My stance on it is you offset after you have done everything else you possibly can. There you go. So P and Will, if you'd like to talk us through with that, it'd be great.
I could talk about it for hours.
Well, let's try a couple of minutes.
I think so as well as that webinar, JB, also have a very detailed fact sheet that you can just read. You don't have to go through the webinar, which is also got a lot in it. There are a couple of different approaches to take, and I think that your sort of overall approach to Meta is absolutely essential to any way to think about offsetting, which is that you must reduce everything first. Offsetting is absolutely a last resort. There are, however, in the arts, in touring, quite a lot of unavoidable emissions that, as Marcus just said, the only way to remove them is just not to do the stuff in the first place. So for us, about over half, coming on for sort of 3/4, a bit more sometimes, of our emissions are road haulage for set and technical equipment and companies traveling, and that's just within the UK mostly. So we're not dealing with flights or anything like that. We're talking about trains, which are already the best way to travel environmentally. And there is, in terms of the road haulage, there's not much we can do other than try and take a bit less stuff with us to avoid a truck. So those emissions we take as being unavoidable, and that is what we offset. My take on that is that removing carbon that's already in the air is better than avoiding somebody else putting something in, because it feels more directly linked to what we're doing. It tends to be a bit more expensive, which makes it a bit more of a deterrent as well, or a bit more of a sort of internal encouragement. Again, we take the view that because most of what we do is in the UK, it makes sense to try and keep our offsetting within the UK. That's a sort of personal choice that we've made. That feels like
name of our organisation, because you've done so much research on the ones that are good and the ones that are not good. So tell everyone listening and watching.
One that I'm particularly keen on at the moment is called Forest Carbon. They do some tree planting, some sort of forestry creation in Scotland mostly, but there's a bit dotted around all over the UK, and they do peat restoration as well. So both of those projects actively, they're both nature-based solutions, and they both actively suck carbon out of the air rather than avoiding somebody else putting it there.
We also plant a lot of trees with our family as a bit of guerrilla, like we live in Somerset, and we just go into fields and plant some trees.
The thing about the really important thing about offsetting that you treat in order to offset your emissions sort of quantitatively, and that you're going to talk about publicly, is to make sure that those emissions are that the reductions, or that the sequestration is permanent, or at least very long. So that's the real thing with forestry creation and tree planting, is that you have to know that those trees are not going to be cut down for at least 100 to otherwise it's pointless. If they're going to get cut down in 30 years time, then all you've done is you've sucked a small amount of carbon out and then you've chucked it back out again. So I think that's really, really key, and that's why I'm quite keen on this forest carbon group in the UK, because they're quite, that's the other good thing about, in my mind, doing things in the UK, is that our regulation about this is relatively strong compared to elsewhere in the world. It's relatively well policed. I mean, nowhere is it very well policed, but better here than in some places. So there's the thing called the Woodland Carbon Code, which they adhere to. It's a gold standard. I'm not quite sure what the body that gives out gold standard as a thing, but there's an offsetting sort of watchdog, essentially, organization internationally that accredits projects like that. There are some other options that I'm really interested in. One thing that I've been sort of trying to think about how we factor into our budgeting for things, and this is very relevant to who pays for things, is the idea of insetting as opposed to offsetting, where you put your own price on the emissions that you can't avoid, and you say, well, we're going to use that carbon price, and we're going to invest that amount of money on something to reduce our own impact in a way that we couldn't otherwise afford to do. So I don't know whether for a venue or a festival, that might allow, over a couple of years of doing that might then allow you to install a bunch of solar panels or something that would reduce your own emissions. So that's an idea that I find really interesting. We have really struggled to build it in, largely because our own emissions are quite small, and therefore the amounts that we're dealing with are quite low. Yet the cost to make those reductions would be quite high. So that's an idea I'm quite keen.
Brilliant.
But I feel I probably waffled.
No, that's great. And Will, just because I had a reminder of it as well, if we could both try and slow down our speech so our BSL interpreters can keep up, because I know and I also stumble over my words as well, so I think we'd love that. And I'm really glad you gave that definition of insetting, and I'm just going to play it back to see if I understood it properly. So insetting is where you as an organisation calculate the price of carbon by kilogram and by ton, and then by calculating your carbon footprint, you then say, okay, well, if we were to pay to offset that, it would be this much. So let's use that money to do a project of some kind of carbon sequestration that's not paying somebody else to do that. Okay, cool. I'm glad I've got that. Thanks for the nods.
Exactly. It's the only thing I would say about it is there is no form of accreditation of anything you do in that form. So it's dependent on whether you're doing it because you want to, or whether you're doing it because you feel you need to have a sort of demonstrable net zero sort of qualification. Yeah.
Because I think in at least in the discourse in the UK now is about net zero and zero carbon and things, with this idea that you could pay somebody else to get you to net zero and things. So I don't know, Marcus or Ruben, I can see some nods and things there. If you've got anything you'd like to add. Genuinely, Marcus, this is just a question for you. What's the world of carbon offsetting like in Germany? Is this something that people are talking about? Do people consider it? Or
yes, of course. When I was working for the Tollwood Festival, we started, I think, 12 or 13 years ago, we started to ask the companies we invited that we shall share the carbon offset price. We collaborate with a carbon offset company. It's called Atmosphere. It's a German company, and I learned also a lot about gold standards agencies. Yeah, and we all know that there are really less standards also available. Yeah, and 12 years ago, it's me, the companies was looking at me. What are you asking us? What is this carbon offset? Yeah, and we asked them to share that 50-50. Yeah, and it's mean when you know it's not so much, and it's more where for European travel. Of course, when you travel from Australia, Canada, it's much more. Yeah, but it's also a question of it's not symbolic, but it's more to show the audience and to show everybody, okay, the festival and the companies, yeah, they work together, they do this together, and they want to together to. And carbon offset, of course, it's always not perfect. Yeah, incense. Yeah, I never heard this before. Yeah, it's really a much better idea. Yeah, and to give an example, when we invited a company from Sweden, it's called Circus Circur, 10 years ago for the first time, they were so surprised that they now, or after this, they decided to put this in their own contracts. Now the company asked the festivals if they will share the contribution. Yeah, so it's making it much more. And like we said in the beginning, yeah, do something good and talk about it. Yeah, of course we did this. Yeah, to the audience and say, okay, we offset the carbon footprint. Yeah, and that's something. Yeah, works very good. Yeah, and it's But additionally, we try, and this is really a big effort. We additionally try to make also carbon offset calculation for the whole festival. And this is really not, because it's a tent-based festival. Yeah, tent-based festival in winter with heating. Yeah, I don't want to talk about it. Yeah, it was a challenge. Yeah, or it is still a challenge. Yeah, but yeah, the people accept the effort. Yeah, and they like it. They do it.
Yeah, it's something about going through the process of doing it. Kind of, it raises awareness in people who might not have considered it before that's there. And Ruben, I was just thinking back to your presentation when your discussion where you were raising the point about measuring the carbon footprint of things, because if you are going to offset or if you are going to inset, you need to know how big your carbon footprint is to start off with. So Ruben, when you're talking there, like, how do you measure the carbon footprint of something like SIRF?
Well, I mean, the methodology for calculating the sustainability and the carbon footprint as a part of that is there, and it's less well developed in some fields than it is in others. And of course, there are all sorts of subjective decisions which you have to take about what bit of the impact you're calculating as your cost and what not. And it's very interesting listening to Marcus talking about the arrival of his audiences by public transport and by bicycle. And of course, the potential to do that is greater in some parts of the world than it is in others. So you get into some very subjective and difficult to be definitive territory. The concern that I have about offset, if I could just take it back to the kind of the original question, is firstly, as you said yourself, it's essentially about addressing symptoms rather than causes in climate change terms. And even with the level of diligence that P and Will have talked about, there's still a very real possibility that your offsetting is undone by some later a deviation from the agreed principles of the initial investment. But more symbolically and more importantly for me, it feels like it's in the territory of the affluent societies believing they can spend their way out of climate change and achieve and enjoy the same level of consumption without making any changes to their lives. So it's at that level that I have the biggest problem with offset.
Yeah, no, that's a really valid point, and really interesting point about that. Affluence and access and things. And actually, so I'm going to see if this is a neat segue into there. But in terms of calculating things, and because at the moment I'm just doing an audience travel survey, footprint from one of the shows in MIF, and what I've been saying with my intern I've been working with, if you remember back to school exams, is show you're working out, you may get marks for it. So I just whatever I do, I keep a record of it as I made that decision and this is where I get to. So anyway, in terms of you were just talking about whether offsetting is a way for affluent societies to basically buy their way out of having to change their consumption patterns, and it's kind of a segue into kind of access and inclusivity and things. And it's not in any way a criticism, but it was just a comment that came in P and Will from you know, from when you were talking about Green Wednesdays and things, and I'm sure it's something that you would be considering anyway. It's just making sure that sustainable or environmental things doesn't cut across access and inclusivity, because the comment came that perhaps a disabled audience member might need to rely on a car or, you know, motorized transport to get to an event. So would they be disqualified from Green Wednesday, or how do you do that? So it's actually, there's lots of different factors to kind of consider when you're doing sustainable things. And also, I can't remember who made the point about plastic straws. I mean, if you ever want a, it's like, you know, paper straws don't work for some people who need straws to drink. So actually, are we creating these kind of straw men, or like well, look, it's all about plastic straws, it's all about compostable face masks? You're like, okay, we're missing the point. Anyway, so I can see lots of nods and conversations in there, and I just wondered if we could spend a little bit of time thinking or talking about, you know, as we're moving to new models and, you know, sustainable touring. And I think, you know, we've touched on it in ways of like, what are the other benefits that could come out of it? So yes, we're reducing our carbon footprints, but I've talked with our international director here about the relentless pace of working internationally, the relentless, you know, exhaustion that comes from being in a different time zone. And then also in terms of access and things, of like, that kind of working is only really available if you don't have family commitments, if you are in full health. So I just wonder if anyone's got any thoughts about what other benefits could come. So rather than it just being, oh, it's financial, it's going to cost more, but actually what else might happen if we move to more sustainable touring models? I don't know who'd like to start.
I'd like to jump in just because, I mean, absolutely. And it's a really valid point about the Green Wednesday thing, but, you know, climate justice is social justice, and we do have to think like about intersectionality. And I think what both sustainable, trying to tour more sustainably, but also kind of COVID pandemic stuff has shown us is, you know, it's really important that we slow down. You know, I think that as makers of work, as promoters and venues and receivers of work, we really need a culture shift that is not about bigger is better, 100 new world premieres. Like, a lot of that comes from a place of ego, and we really need to put that kind of out the window. And that, I mean, that will mean different models. You know, it might mean sitting down in places for longer. It might mean fewer shows. It might mean changing our aesthetic expectations around what things look like or feel like, or, you know, all of those things, and sort of creating a new normal that absolutely isn't kind of the expansionist, extractivist, growth economics view of the world that we've all consumerist kind of been spoon-fed. But that's really, it's such a big, because it is a cultural shift. So everyone who's in charge of, you know, the artists, the venues, the promoters, the funders, they all need to be on board with that for that to happen. And going right back to what Ruben was saying about, you know, which I do think it'd be amazing if all partners took financial responsibility, you know, for funders to do that. It would be amazing if in this country, national portfolio organizations or the regularly funded organization, if the Arts Council said, as part of, you know, there are environmental standards for NPOs, but if the Arts Council said, as part of this, you have to commit something, not necessarily to offsetting, but to the cost, you know, the true cost of that, then those changes would happen. But actually that kind of deep cultural change, it has to come, I think it has to come from the top and the bottom at the same time. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I was just thinking actually, Ruben, when you were starting, you were talking about kind of the not the cult of, but the premiere thing of just like, we want to be the first, we want to be the biggest, you know. And Marcus, you're nodding there, like, how do we shift those attitudes? Because, or, you know, it's that thing of like, we all need to make the change together, but all it'll take is one organization go, well, actually, we're going to go this way, you know what I mean? So yes.
I don't think that's as hard a shift to make as we might try and excuse ourselves by describing it as, if that's not too convoluted a way of expressing it. I think I think P, you're right that there's some ego in that. I know that from the festival, which I've been involved with for, you know, a quarter of a century, I know how popular some shows are, and it's not the ones that are first to come into the country. necessarily. It might be, but that's not why. It's not the ones that are biggest or most carbon intensive that we weren't thinking about that, you know, until recently. And we've seen shows in the showcase earlier today, you know, emerging shows that, of course, are sensitive to the reduced carbon impact and the greater return on that investment and the kind of more immersive work with communities. And of course, that's not new. So I don't think it's as hard to shift people's expectations, but it does have to come from top and bottom, because it is about the NPOs and the funders themselves, and I include local authorities in that, saying, hang on a minute, we want consideration to be given to the carbon impact and see what that leads to, and that helps the companies who are thinking of it, and then we get change coming from both directions.
I think that's yeah. So thank you, Ruben. That's kind of given me a bit of hope there for the future. And I'm not kind of pulling Marcus in to be like, and we've heard the British thing and there, but I'm just thinking internationally. So I talk a lot with my access colleague at MIF about what we do in terms of access and sustainability. And one of the things is legislation is different all around the world. Cultural expectations are different all around the world. If you're making work that's, you know, sustainable, that's considered its carbon footprint, what happens if you're touring to a country where those factors aren't a consideration, and so people aren't going to pay you more for it? So once you know, move out of this country, and you know, we, even though Brexit's closed our doors, we don't really want that to happen, but yeah, how do you take what you're doing to other countries and to other spaces? I know P and Will, you were talking about having green riders and you know, organizations and venues not having the capacity to kind of respond to those things. But maybe Ruben, you've had the experience of international working and things. I don't know, we can't really take a temperature check, can we, of like, how's the world on sustainable arts at the moment? But it's just something that occurred to me, that actually how much of this is transferable, how much is it global, and what happens, you know? So yes, Will.
Yeah.
And then Marcus. I think that okay. I'll be very quick, Marcus. There's a I think there are sort of two parts to what we need everybody to be thinking about. There's the topic of today. There's the who's paying for what, and the sort of the crunch of that, which is definitely an issue. But I think sort of underneath that, there's the value question of who wants what, and I think that in the way you were putting that question, I don't think that that's an issue anymore. Like 5-10 years ago, there were plenty of people all over the world who didn't really want to have to think about this. But actually, you know, from the news more broadly, I don't get the impression that there are very many countries or places within the world that don't think this is important. You know, massive generalization, of course, and so it's about the sort of the step from the we want to do it to how do we manage to do it, rather than are they going to think we're weird when we turn up and ask for something?
Yeah, no, I
think is how it used to be.
Yes,
and I think it's much less that now. It's now they're going to question how they can pay for it, rather than they're going to think that this is a strange thing to even want to think about. Which is a change, which is a positive change. We're not all the way there yet, but it is definitely a positive change.
Yeah. So Marcus, did you want to add something?
Yeah. It's really very difficult, because it's been one point, and we were all smiling, when we're talking about the discussion about the right of the first night, about the ego of the festivals, that every festival want to have the right of the first night, want to be exclusive, and this is something I think we can change. This, we are on the way. Maybe it has to do with the pandemic, and the people are more, they don't want to have everything exclusive. This is something we can change, but to do a well-planned tour and a really sustainable, perfect planned tour where every week, every night, the company is just traveling 50 kilometers, and the next, it's almost impossible in reality. And it has to be clear for us to say it generally, we are part of the problem. We are not part of the solution. It's mean we produce CO2. Yeah, we produce this. We can try to reduce it. Yeah, but I don't have any. It's mean I have a lot of ideas in my head, but I can offer any solution to how to make a realistic, ecological, green tour plan. When in a perfect world, I would sit and say, okay, today we start in London, we go to Manchester, we go to Edinburgh, then we go to the next country, then we go to the next continent. But in reality, it's almost impossible, and I'm afraid this will last for years. Maybe we need some pressure. We need maybe some pressure by founders, by subsidies. Maybe this has to be combined. I have no idea, but actually it's really one of the most important point. But sorry, I have no solution.
No.
If I have it, I would. I would have.
Can I respond to that? Partly because one of the songs in my eco rock musical is called "Part of the Problem." You're right. Of course, we are all. I'm quoting my own lyrics. We are all part of the problem. But I think that the arts sector can be part of the solution too, because and I don't mean that everyone's show has to be deeply about the complexities of climate stuff, but because it's so visible, as we've talked about the little things, we have the power of the art, both in terms of like the emotional journey we can take an audience on to maybe engage them, to get them slightly more activated around climate stuff, but also just the visibility of seeing that those things are now mainstream. That's, I think, incredibly kind of politically important, because shifting the dial on what is now kind of a normal expectation of, a citizen of the world, theatre and performing arts has such a kind of massive role to play in that. So I think that's why I would say it's okay that our sectors are still existing, even though they're going to make carbon impact, because actually the positive social impact could have a much bigger reach. And say we get a load of MPs along to some of these festivals and they see the masks and they see the eco rock musical or whatever. That's, I think, where we can absolutely be part of the solution as well.
And also in terms of the arts, performing arts, whatever, like opening up space for other possibilities and presenting visions of the future for people to kind of discuss. And sorry, Ruben, you had to come in.
Well, sorry, it wasn't to cut across you. It was just the consideration of that touring viability, or the viability of a tour which only goes 50 kilometers. If it's based on London, Manchester, Edinburgh, of course it's not possible. But what's coming out of COVID is an appreciation of local community and an appreciation of a level of engagement that is achievable within a smaller geography, and where we might make possible the multiple short distance tours that are much more local than Edinburgh, Manchester, London, because they are about towns and small cities where the audience has a different relationship with the work, because the work is about facilitating a relationship with the fellow members of that community. And I guess that's already happening, and it happens in some forms of work and so on. But it's accentuation and the pursuit of that might make some of our touring practice more sustainable. But I absolutely buy the point. And Marcus, I started by saying the best thing we could do is maybe all be dead. So I do buy the basic principle.
So we started on a cheerful note, didn't we? And actually, Ruben, I was struck when you were saying that 80% of your audience come from so local. So actually, world premiere, and I think one of the things that's come through COVID is our connection to our locality and our communities and things. Will, you had a point.
Yes, I just wanted to add that I think that Marcus's point of needing to acknowledge that we will always have an impact. But the value of what we do is much bigger than just that impact. Like, we're not talking about selling a product that actually nobody needs. We're talking about doing something that fundamentally makes the world a better place, and that it is therefore, we need to be able to absorb some of that impact. Obviously, we need to reduce it as much as we can, but I think that's really important. But the idea of the impossibly perfect tour, or the perfect tour, I think it's really valid. And this idea, like I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we could make our touring routes better. And partly it's impossible at the moment because we're dependent on who books what and timings and all sorts of things. But also, as you said earlier, you rule people out of taking part in the process. If we're going to send people off on a tour where they go 50 kilometers a day from venue to venue, from place to place, and they don't go home in between, then as you said before, everybody with a family can't do it. So I think all of those, we can work out the perfect routing and all of these things, but it doesn't actually work in the real world anyway, even if it were possible to achieve. So I guess I think that there are more parts to it than some of the arguments I'd like to make.
It's just reminded me when I was thinking about what we could do to do touring internationally sustainable. I can't remember. I think it was just an individual's blog. I think he worked for Arab, but Arab have developed an AI tool for when the World Cup is going to be in the USA, I think. And so this AI plotted where to put the football matches in the most sustainable way, which cities to have that. And this was a thought experiment of like, could you apply the same AI to plotting a theatre tour? Like what's the most, and it's exactly as you say, Will, it's like, what's most sustainable on paper or on screen just doesn't apply because all of the things we talked about, theatres want this before that, they're different sizes, but just that idea of like maybe you could just feed it all into a computer and it could tell us like the most sustainable way of doing things.
On that, there are some things you can do that you can plug into a computer. So when we have a tour booked for one of our shows, I tend to spend a very long time working out where we should find a haulage provider but sort of in the middle of that, on the basis of where they're going to be able to go from place to place, where they're going to want to go back to their warehouse in between. And I tend to, that's exactly that kind of thing. Once you've got some parameters defined, you can then start finding the concrete best on paper solution to bits of it. But we have to accept that there are some variables that fall outside that.
We have to avoid perfection being the enemy of good, don't we? So we have to still pursue things, even though we can't achieve it in its finite form, in its ultimate form. And that means presenting festivals which do incorporate some shows that are part of those tours that we might think are more sustainable and some that aren't. And it means the commissioners of those festivals collaborating to make some parts of that possible, while still, if they're required by their sponsors and funders to do so, still having some things that are a UK or a European premiere. We have to be able to pursue the bits that are good and not do them just because we can't go all the way.
Yeah, so I've got a question that's come through that relates to that, and I'm just going to read it to make sure that I've got the wording of it right. So the question is, I'm sure that many agree with the idea that festivals need to work together more to share artists. However, this does inevitably mean there'll be fewer artists on tour, each of whom will do more shows in a more sustainable way. So does this mean fewer opportunities for artists, and how do we ensure that new and emerging artists find their place, as this model could favour established, tried and tested artists? So how do we balance an ecosystem of artists touring and also have space to take risks? Yes, Ruben.
Well, you could argue that the more sustainable model that we've described, which has more locations in any given tour, promotes a greater number of festivals, because it fosters a relationship between the festival and a more local audience. So you can sustain more festivals, and more festivals means more shows in total, means more opportunities for artists. They just change. And you could, of course, argue that there's an intensity about the work that makes it work for artists for shorter periods of time in their careers, and they therefore create opportunities for succession earlier on. There's all sorts of impacts that you should explore, but I don't think we should accept that there's automatically a reduction in the net opportunities for artists, because we will do it well and creatively, and we will make it relevant, and we will make new things happen as a sector that make the role of the artist and importance of the arts even more apparent to people, and that will feed growth.
So there's space for everybody if we just
I just want to jump in on that
and
say, because once upon a time I was an emerging artist. When you say space for growth, I mean, in a way we've got to move away from a growth model, and in fact the version of this thing where more festivals band together, we are talking about fewer shows being on tour. So essentially that is a kind of degrowth model for the volume of artists who will be in work. I mean, there's a much bigger, this is really controversial, you know, I sort of mentioned this earlier, we have a much, much greater supply, even with people dropping away out of changing career from pandemic, a much, much greater supply of artists than we do of work to sustain them. So I think a lot of artists going into the industry are really having to grapple with the fact that, yes, you are a professional artist, you've trained in it for some number of years, you occasionally make your living from it, but a lot of the time you don't make your living from it. And that's that can be an uncomfortable sort of thing to have to grapple with, but we maybe just have to sit with that reality. Sorry, the emerging artist is not very nice for you. But I think that's for all kind of market forces reasons, even without these new models coming in, that is the reality. And actually, we just have to sort of engage with portfolio careers and all the rest of it, I think is the solution.
Yeah. So Marcus, did you have something to add into that? I think that idea of facing the reality.
I just have an idea and let me think something I've never thought before. Yeah, maybe in the next futures, in 5 or in 10 years, we all have a budget of CO2. Maybe in the future, the festival say, okay, I really would like to invite you, but I don't have enough money, but my carbon footprint budget is empty. Yeah. Or when you're sitting there and say, shall we invite the company A, or for this with this budget we can invite the other companies twice, or something like this. Maybe this will be a realistic future thing. Yeah, happens in 5 or 10 years. Yeah, I don't know if this is a good idea or if it's making me a little bit afraid.
Great idea.
It's not so unrealistic. I hope. Well, I'm afraid. I don't know.
Well, actually, Marcus, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things I have in my environmental action plan that I've written for the Manchester International Festival, and we're moving into a new venues, I want to develop carbon budgets. So that sits alongside the financial budget, and then there's your carbon budget. But the thing I need for that, as ever, is data. So how much carbon? So yes, it's always the way. I've just noticed, actually, we are coming very, very close towards the end of our discussion, and I've enjoyed it ever so much. I'm hearing from everybody, and I think it's encompassed so many different aspects that I'm not going to try and summarize it. So if you want to know what we discussed, you can watch it all back again. But I think there's some real tangible things in there to think about, like the practicalities of counting all the carbon, accounting for it, thinking about whether you're going to offset it, and then not forgetting the real transcendent power of the arts, like not getting bogged down in the data and things, and having hope for the future. Because if we do, I mean, you know, Ruben, you did start off by saying, well, probably the best thing for us all is if we didn't do anything and we all died. You're like, well, we don't want to live in a world like that. We want to live in a world that has international connections, that shares knowledge and culture globally. It's just important that we think about what we're doing while we're doing it. So I don't know if anybody would like to share some final thoughts, and then I can hand over to Hannah.
So I just would say one final thing. You can, so you in the UK, you can be really very, very grateful, that you have a company or that you have an institution like Julie's Bicycle. This is so helpful, and we are so jealous in Germany that you have something like Julie's Bicycle. We try to copy it now for Germany, which is really a challenge, but we learned so much from Julie's Bicycle, and also they did the last.
Yeah, no, it's really good that you mentioned that, because also it's Julie's Bicycle, but also in connection with Arts Council England. It's 2012 that they made that that mandate that all national portfolio organisations, every organisation that receives regular funding, needs to have an environmental policy and a plan and report on that, and that's had a really big impact. We need to step up and do more, but that's there. You know, Arts Council were the first ones to do it, and I think that's worth acknowledging.
They're really jealous.
But we can share, because that's what you can do. Do you know what I mean? I often think that a piece of knowledge is only valuable once you start sharing it. If you keep it to yourself, there's no value to it. So let's share knowledge rather than jumping on planes. So Hannah, I think we've come to the end of our discussion, and I'd like to thank you ever so much for having us all along today. And I'd just like to hand over to you to close it all off.
Thank you so much, Feimatta, and also to all of our speakers. What an interesting discussion, and yeah, I'm sure we could keep going for hours on this topic, couldn't we? But as Feimatta's mentioned, it is available to replay if anybody would like to watch the session again. We'll also do our best to capture as many of those amazing links and resources that have been shared during the session, and make sure those are available and accessible for people afterwards as well. Also, huge thanks to our BSL captioners and tech team at Nomad IT for keeping up with us and supporting the smooth running of the event today. And also to our audience, thank you so much for attending this session. This completes our programme for today. And I'd just like to remind you that the Xtrax and Stockton International Riverside Festival showcase continues tomorrow on Swapcard. We'll start the day with the Meet the Festival session at 9:30 AM UK time. This will be followed by our second set of artist pitches. In the afternoon, we've made some time to allow you to go and visit and make connections in our virtual exhibitor hall. And then finally, we'll wrap up the showcase with our second panel discussion, which this time we'll be talking about the value of international programming and exchange. But for all of that information, you can just visit the programme tab within the Swapcard platform. So thank you all again, and hope to see you soon.